But here we go, back by popular demand, another top 100 list, brother. Have I bitten off more than I can chew? I don't know. We're going to find out. On today's episode, we're counting down the top 100 wrestlers of the 2000s. What that means, kids, is from 2000 until 2010. This decade was a lot different than the other two decades we've covered, as we've done the 80s and the 90s already. In the 2000s, there was no major competition for WWE after WCW closed in 2001. Of course, TNA wrestling did exist. Ring of Honor started doing stuff during this decade as well. We'll sprinkle in those guys here and there, but just a bit of fair warning, this is going to be a very WWE dominant list. Before I get going, just going to ask real quick for you to like this video and also subscribe to this channel for more lists and pro wrestling fun. His claim to fame, of course, is being in a tag team with Johnny Nitro, known as M&M. Solid guy, he was around, we had to start somewhere, you know what I mean? This relative of Carlito was, of course, super over down in the Puerto Rican territory. He came up to America in the WWE in the latter part of the decade, and sadly, all he would ever become is kind of a lower card tag team guy. I just don't want people to forget the potential he had at one point. Don't get me wrong, I totally love Dustin Rhodes, but during this decade, he was kind of all over the place. You know, he was gold dust for a lot of the time in WWE, but it was very much like a weird lower card kind of jobber version of gold dust and a comedy character, more or less. In the middle of the decade, he did weird stuff with TNA, like his Black Rain and all that, so he'd probably tell you himself that this decade probably wasn't his favorite. Pretty sure he was battling his addictions off and on during this decade as well, so it is what it is. They brought Hawkins in with his partner, Zack Ryder, right in the late 2000s there, I think right around 07. That stuff was very memorable stuff. I mean, he basically is still making a career off of that to this day. He gets ranked lower than Ryder because obviously Ryder stuck around and he didn't. Man, we're having fun here, aren't we? The Great Khali. Oh my gosh. Some will think it's kind of laughable to put him on a top 100 list. I do get that argument, believe me, I do. But he was a WWE World Champion during this decade, so that has to count for something. A believable, menacing monster, for better or for worse. How many holds do you really need to know? You know what I mean? Here we start to sprinkle in some of that Ring of Honor talent into the list, and the Briscoe brothers were their prolific tag team even from the early days. Him and his brother Jay Briscoe would of course flirt with WWE opportunities in the next decade, but make no mistake about it, that was all set up by their strong work in the decade of the 2000s. Woo woo woo, you know it, am I right? Ryder was able to transition out of the edgehead gimmick very well and make a name for himself. Ultimately, that would only get him so far in WWE, be that no fault of his own. But you could definitely see as this decade came to a close that the guy had some serious momentum and some serious star potential. While his better work was obviously in the next two decades, this is where it all started right here. Another Ring of Honor guy here, Colt Cabana, was a staple of that promotion during the decade of the 2000s. It's easy to forget, and I think people do forget how much of a prospect that Colt Cabana actually was at this time. And by the end of the decade, he actually ended up with a little WWE run as Scotty Goldman. Ultimately, he really ended up being nothing more than a job guy there, but at least at the time, I think you can make a pretty good case for that being just a bunch of wrestling politics. You know, Waltman had quite the little decade here. It started off with him being in WWE. He would then assume various names on the indies and do some TNA work at some points as well. Because he became a non-full-timer during this decade, it kind of hurts his cause here. But hey, he still appears here, still worked during the decade, so there you go. Rene Dupree, great look, a lot of potential there. WWE brought him in around 2002 or so to be a part of the La Resistance gimmick that they were doing there. Another young guy that you could just say maybe had trouble weathering the storm in the WWE. He's been very vocal in recent years about some of the issues that he had backstage with certain wrestlers and whether or not maybe that had something to do with his career turning out the way it did. His experience was obviously bad, as we've never seen him back in the promotion again. We talked about Mark earlier, Jay, of course, the other half of the Briscoe Brothers tag team, and it's no secret, Mark would even tell you himself, Jay was always kind of earmarked as the better wrestler of the tag team, so he is going to rank a little bit higher here. Jay would end up having great success as a singles guy in Ring of Honor within that next decade, showing his versatility, but we're not talking about the 2010s here, we're talking about the 2000s, and at this point they were just getting going, and honestly Ring of Honor, of course, really a blip on the map at this point. I think by around 2008 they finally got their first nationally televised deal with the HD Net show, even more limited than the reach of something like TNA. One thing you can say about WWE in the 2000s is that for better or for worse, they pretty much had a cruiserweight division for a good part of the decade, especially the beginning of it. And how much time and thought they put into it all is a whole nother story in of itself. But be that as it may, Jamie Noble, of course, is a guy that was a standout, was pushed fairly well, and was a very memorable character. He even left WWE for a time to Ring of Honor, came back. WWE Cruiserweight champion, for what that's worth. Kendrick had a really interesting WWE career for being one of the smaller guys. It's usually a pretty tough road for them, but they actually, at least they tried to do a couple things with him. Obviously, his run with Paul London as the tag team of Kendrick and London was probably his best and most memorable part of this decade in his career. But, you can't forget the time they brought him back as the Brian Kendrick. And if I remember right, they kind of sort of were testing him out as like something, and they give him like Ezekiel Jackson as his manager. Seemed like they were kind of giving him a go as a mid-card heel type guy. Also, when he wasn't there, he was doing great work on the indies, so if that counts for something for you, which it does to me, that's why he makes this top 100. Roddy, of course, just getting his career going with Ring of Honor at this point in time. Other indie stuff as well. But when I refer to these guys, if they had any amount of Ring of Honor work, that's basically how I'm going to refer to them as for the context of this video. So another guy synonymous with that company, you could argue one of the pillars, one of the cornerstones. Great work, and it all started in the decade here of the 2000s. Everything I just said about Roderick Strong, you can also copy that down for Austin Aries. Pretty much parallel paths here. Great, solid Ring of Honor wrestlers, but I'm going to call it like it is, okay? This time, WWE was not keen on hiring guys of this size. You still hear about this stuff to this day, of course, not so much, but living through this, I can definitely tell you that it was a thing. Of course, for the purpose of this list here, I'm not going to let that discount him at all for all that solid work he did during this 2000s decade. Of course, at first they were just kind of Haas and Benjamin, and then they were kind of called Team Angle, and then that transferred into being known as the world's greatest tag team. Honestly, though, Shelton was kind of always thought of as the star of this team, and Charlie Haas married Jackie Gaeta, so you tell me who won. After splitting around the middle of the decade, they would reunite later on in Ring of Honor in the latter part of the decade. You got to give it to Mark Henry. Most of his critics Figured his career would be completely over by the time the decade of the 2000s hit, but he proved all those folks wrong. And you can say without a doubt, during this decade, he did obviously his best work that he ever did. He was a force as an upper mid-card, sometimes main event monster heel. Got to have a WrestleMania match with Taker during this decade. Pretty sure he even had a world heavyweight title run somewhere in there. Correct me if I'm wrong. Although we don't think of him as an amazing professional wrestler, career accomplishments rank really high with the way I kind of do this here, if you haven't noticed. London had it going in that tag team with Brian Kendrick, as I mentioned earlier. A run or two with the WWE tag team titles was very significant at this point in time. Be that as it may, the famous story is that he was pretty much doomed the moment that he smiled during the Vince McMahon death angle. I know it sounds ridiculous, but as the story goes, Vince is walking out. There's a bunch of wrestlers there. Everyone's supposed to stare off. Paul London goes into business for himself and smiles. And in wrestling, people don't really like that. He did some great indie work afterwards, though. Edwards debuted in 2002, worked indies for about 4 years until he landed in Ring of Honor in 2006. Went and did some stuff in Japan and, really crafted his work during the 2000s decade. Would go on to win many, many tag team championships with his partner Davey Richards as the American Wolves. We all have Petey Williams to thank for the invention of the Destroyer move. At least I'm pretty sure I do. Petey, of course, made his mark mainly in TNA wrestling during this decade. Did memorable stuff as a part of Team Canada there. And then even more memorable stuff when he was the sidekick of Big Papa Pump. Great wrestler in this decade who could seemingly do it all. Sabin was a huge part of TNA wrestling pretty much from its inception. One of the crown jewels of their X division. And let me tell you, during this decade, the X division, for me, for a lot of fans, did really mean something. Regardless of what TNA was doing, we could look at that X division and be like, man, that's some awesome stuff right there. And Chris Sabin was a huge part of that. The other half of the American Wolves, we talked about Eddie Edwards earlier, can pretty much duplicate that here for Davey Richards. Another one of those cases of it being a great team, but also great singles wrestlers individually. That's something that I can't stress enough, because in some of these previous decade lists that I've done here, a lot of the time the tag teams wouldn't get ranked because as singles wrestlers, they were pretty much ass. I'm sorry. No disrespect. You put Road Warrior Animal in a match by himself, how good is it really going to be? You know what I mean? But in this decade, it was a lot different. We had guys in tag teams that could really go as singles wrestlers as well, because everybody ultimately trying to prove themselves beyond being in any kind of tag team. Davey Richards, in this case, was always thought of the slightly better guy of the two, although I think it was very, very close. You could argue Eddie was the better one, and I'd be inclined to listen to your argument, because I think, it just comes down to a matter of taste, right? Of course, he would start the decade here as Claudio Castagnoli in Ring of Honor. That's where we would first see him. And he was obviously a huge standout there because he was honestly one of the bigger guys on their roster. Naturally, he would be a guy that would end up in WWE sooner or later, because out of all those Ring of Honor guys, he was the biggest guy of them all. Going back to what I was talking about earlier with the whole size thing and the Ring of Honor guys. So stick with me here, all right? You wouldn't just do Ring of Honor. A lot of these guys, they would do all the major indies, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, most notably. Claudio was no different, and the work he did here set him up for his next decade, which would be in WWE. The early part of the decade, Test was very, very solid. I really forget how much he was actually around during that early part of the decade with WWE. You even tend to forget stuff like his run in the Un-Americans with Lance Storm and Christian, that sort of thing. And I think even more people forget his little run in the revamped version of ECW that WWE forced us all to watch. I don't know. He seems solid right here. Seems okay with me. We did lose him before the decade was over, which was definitely sad. Hey, who could forget the short-lived run of Reverend Devon, am I right? Hey, that did give Batista his start. All kidding aside, though, I think Devon could hold his own as a singles wrestler. His work was definitely okay, but it's not like anyone really overly enjoyed it, you know what I mean? I believe he started the decade as the Right to Censor version of himself, and then I think briefly turned back into Val Venus. After that, I think was his little run as Chief Morley with Eric Bischoff. Then we basically never heard from him again. He's a very outspoken person online nowadays, I think would just be the most politically correct way to put it. You know, he burst onto the Ring of Honor scene in the later part of the decade here, which, like many, of course, would set up a WWE run in the next decade. If you're a fan of Sami Zayn and you've never went back and looked up his El Generico stuff, I mean, what are you doing? Go check that out when we're done with the countdown here, all right? Well, you can't talk about El Generico without talking about Kevin Steen. These are two other Ring of Honor guys, pretty much synonymous with each other. Coin flip as to say who had the better decade. They were both just kind of getting going. Once again, might come down to just a matter of taste. I have Steen, later known as Kevin Owens, here just above El Generico. You know, he had a nice high-profile little run in the WWE there in the early part of the decade. It's actually quite astonishing, really, if I'm being honest with everyone here. Like, if you would have told me WCW guys that would end up on, like, let's say the WrestleMania 23 card or whatever, Fit Finlay would not have been a guy that I would have guessed. Just by that fact alone, I would say he had a great decade, wouldn't you? WWE had this guy win the Intercontinental title in his debut match, and in such a quick time span went from such a boring character to one of the most over, entertaining, funny, comedic characters in all of the wrestling business and maybe all of wrestling history. WWE even teased him winning the Royal Rumble at one point, and people actually believed it and were like kind of psyched for it. During this decade, the future Seth Rollins would get his start. A lot of Ring of Honor guys getting their start here that are kind of shoved down towards the bottom of this list, but it is what it is. It really comes down to an exposure thing, and overall, during the decade of the 2000s, the people who knew Tyler Black's name, really not that many to count, but I don't think that should discount the work that he did. Spoiler alert, he will probably jump significantly in the next decade's list, I can guarantee it. This one might make a few people mad here. Don't really care. Huge star, but of course was only really active maybe a couple years out of this whole decade altogether. And believe me, it wasn't his most memorable work, as it was combined the dying days of WCW coupled with his first WWE run, which, come on, anyone and their grandma will tell you that that thing did not work out quite the way it was planned. If there even was a plan. WWE debuted MVP in around the middle part of the decade, right around 2005 or so. To his credit, he was brought in with a lot of hype, and to his credit, I didn't think for a million years he would end up working out. It seems like guys that they had given that sort of gimmick just never ended up working out. I think a lot about like Tiger Ali Singh back in the 90s. He really gave me those sort of vibes when he first started appearing on WWE television, but like I said, to his credit, he proved me, and I'm sure a lot of other wrestling fans, wrong. He worked hard and became a very great, solid mid-card competitor for the WWE, did his job well, had a pretty memorable United States title run. Ultimately, that ended up being his ceiling, but I don't think that was any kind of fault of his own, if you know what I mean. I was first called to the attention of Matt Sydal back in the early 2000s with Wrestling Society X. Might be the first and only time that promotion's name is dropped on this countdown, but hey. He then did some stuff with TNA off and on, but ended up landing in the WWE around the middle of the decade as Evan Bourne. Had a very memorable tag team run with Kofi Kingston as Air Boom. Won the tag team titles and seemed like he was pretty well liked and well used in WWE, and then of course an injury ultimately put a stop to all that. This is where it all started for Drew here. He debuted with so much fanfare, given the gimmick as being the chosen one of Vince McMahon's. Really just ultimately kind of an impossible thing to live up to. They let him do that for a couple years and then they just ditched him. Pushed down to the lower card. Another big part of TNA during the decade, solid worker, part of Team Canada. Arguably could be about 10 spots too high here on this list, but hey. If there was an award for the king of the indies of the entire decade of the 2010s, it would more than likely go to our buddy here, Chris Hero. He was really the true indie workhorse of the decade. Ultimately, by the end of the decade, he was a stable Ring of Honor competitor. His next decade in the wrestling business would obviously be a little bit more interesting with some WWE flirtation, but the guy definitely had a storied career, and it all started right here in the 2000s. In the very early days of TNA wrestling, James Storm was in a tag team with Chris Harris, known as America's Most Wanted, and they were pretty much the staple tag team of TNA during those early days. He would later go on to another memorable tag team with Bobby Roode with Beer Money. That being said, he could always hold his own as a singles wrestler as well, even in these early days, I think, which set him up great for the future, but we'll have to save that for another time. He did it for The Rock. He did it for the people. He did it for everyone. Very memorable stuff from him, but in a short amount of time, although it was on the biggest stage you can get. If we're being honest though here, I mean, come on, the stink face, total game changer, man. Total game changer. This guy, of course, one of the standouts of the very early versions of TNA wrestling. An import from Mexico. I guess that's what ultimately kind of hindered him from being a bigger star here in the United States. Truly a talent that was ahead of his time, and I just think he could have been a really huge star if TNA would have had more exposure, or if he would have somehow ended up in the WWE. Sometimes, though, that's not the best thing for guys like this, you know what I mean? Talked about Devon already. I think we can all agree that Bubba was quite a bit ahead of Devon as a singles wrestler. I think he proved that time and time again with the times that he got to do single stuff in WWE as well as later on in TNA. He would prove that even more in the next decade. Foreshadowing. This guy had everything that Vince McMahon and the WWE wanted at the time. He had the looks, he had the size, he had okay wrestling skill. So what happened? Well, to be honest with you, I don't really know. Don't think he's really said too much negative about the WWE in years, but at the end of the day, I think it's pretty much another political thing. He either didn't do something right somewhere or didn't quite perform up to the expectations someplace, and sometimes that's all it takes. A business of professional wrestling is a cruel, cutthroat business at the end of the day. Don't let anyone try to tell you that it's not. I'm the boogeyman and I'm coming to get you. Who could ever forget that? Who could ever get that out of their nightmares? I mean, come on. This dude ate worms. You could argue that his ring work, of course, wasn't the best. Don't you get it, man? Sometimes it's about more than that. Don't you see? The start of the decade, he was doing awesome ECW stuff, and surprisingly, he parlayed that into a nice little few-year career in the WWE once ECW closed. Of course, we all loved him for his work, but without a doubt, it was his comedic sensibility as a bumbly foreigner that endeared him to Vince McMahon and kept him around, I can almost assure you. I mean, I don't think there's any reason why Tajiri couldn't have been the Japanese version of Rey Mysterio to this day, you know what I mean? There's really no good reason why not. We first saw him with Rosie as a part of the 3-Minute Warning tag team in around 2002. He did that for a little bit, and then after some personal turmoil, eventually resurfaced in the WWE as Umaga. With the recent prominence in WWE with the Samoan bloodline and all that, there's been a lot of talk about Umaga and they almost talk about him in hindsight like he was some kind of prolific force in the company, and while he was great, don't get me wrong, I just want to kind of serve a little reality check here that he was pretty much a mid-card, upper mid-card monster heel. I don't even think we could really consider him a main eventer. He definitely could have progressed into such, but of course, sadly his life was cut tragically short, so we'll never really know. Speaking of Umaga, here's this guy, Bobby Lashley, which you can't argue that both Umaga and Bobby Lashley, their biggest match of the decade, was getting to take part in the Battle of the Billionaires at WrestleMania 23, where Bobby Lashley represented Donald Trump, Umaga represented Vince McMahon. Lashley had it all going for him, seemingly. Even did a pay-per-view main event with John Cena later on in that year, but then he just kind of abruptly quit wrestling. Who knows what he could have done if he would have stayed around later in the decade. In the early part of the decade, the WWE really tried to make Billy Gunn into something that people cared about as a singles wrestler. But it seemed like no matter what they did, none of it would take. He eventually ended up reunited with the Road Dogg in TNA Wrestling in the middle part of the decade. Regardless of all that, between the two companies, he was around all the time and pretty much on your television screen every single week. Kid Cash started the decade in ECW, and when that closed in 2001, he was one of the guys that WWE just didn't call. From there, he basically spent the next few years working for TNA Wrestling. I would say it was arguably a pretty big part of getting that promotion going, was one of the bigger stars that they had, I would say, and one of the better wrestlers. Eventually, WWE gave him a job around 2005, I want to say. He wasn't really long for the WWE universe, and from there he kind of faded into obscurity, I would say. Be that as it may though, very strong first part of the decade. I don't think you can argue that Steiner was one of the top 5 WCW guys on the day that it closed. He eventually ended up in WWE in 2003, and what a really unique short run that he had there. I mean, I don't really recall any other wrestler ever being like brought into a company, literally main eventing like 2 or 3 pay-per-views and then just like being gone. Very strange set of circumstances surrounding that. I don't think that is really talked about enough, quite honestly. From there, Steiner went to TNA to make his money, became very synonymous with them as one of their main event guys. Still very much high profile for even being on the low profile. We're halfway through the countdown here, and if you haven't subscribed at this point, I don't know, I'm just kind of taking it personally. Please smash that subscribe button, hit the bell. I don't bombard people with my videos. I put one out whenever I feel like it. You guys can be cool with that, right? Arguably, perhaps the most prolific wrestler in Ring of Honor's early days, their most decorated main event heel at a crucial time going into their first national television deal. As the decade came to a close, WWE pretended like they were interested in him. However, instead, he would end up in TNA Wrestling as Desmond Wolfe, where sadly his in-ring career pretty much got cut short. He might be one of the biggest what-if stories of this whole decade. Hey, we all loved Carlito, right? I mean, he settled right in there nicely as a mid-card performer that I think really endeared himself to the WWE audience there in the mid-2000s. In fact, when he turned back up a few years ago, the great reactions he was getting from the crowd and the crowd remembering him, that of course parlayed into this whole new run he's been doing with the company here in recent years. But make no mistake about it, the decade of the 2000s was the time for Carlito. Sadly, he never excelled past the mid-card, but he was someone that you always looked at as someone who could with a little bit of work and elbow grease. You know, these TNA guys pop up on the list here and there, and of course, I'm sure I'll get a negative comment or two about it, but it's okay. Kazarian really made himself a name in the TNA X division, so much so that WWE was more than interested in bringing him in, and he did end up coming in for a cup of coffee, but ultimately it didn't work out. Be that as it may, he continued doing indie stuff and TNA stuff throughout the rest of the decade and put in some pretty damn good work, I'll say. At first, he was Johnny Nitro in the M&M tag team. From there, he transitioned into being John Morrison, which of course you would say is probably his most well-known run. Let's not forget, though, that this guy came from Tough Enough. I don't think we should hold that against him, but I do think that it's interesting that he's not really labeled as a Tough Enough guy when you look at him and his career. You know what I mean? Maybe it's because he went through such a drastic transformation in between the gimmicks. I don't know. But for all intents and purposes, I will say that he was one of the more exciting wrestlers WWE had on the roster in the latter part of the 2000s decade. Once again, someone I wanted to rank a lot higher on the list, but I'll be damned if exposure isn't a thing, you know, just because he spent most of the decade in the indies doing the Ring of Honor stuff and this and that. It just pushes him down on this list for those reasons. When I think about this and I put this list together, it's not just based solely on wrestling talent or skill. It does count for something. In hindsight, though, now that the guy is pretty much retired, and I was a fan of him his whole career. The stuff he did in Ring of Honor during the 2000s, I think, is pretty much unmatched and undoubtedly his best stuff. Kofi burst onto the scene for us in the WWE right around the mid-decade, and of course he instantly made an impression upon all wrestling fans with his unique high spots and charisma, even if he was putting on a fake accent. Most fans, though, loved and had a soft spot for Kofi. This would endure throughout the years, even into the next decade with Kofi Mania. And I've said it before in this countdown, and I'll say it again, this was the beginning of all of that, and still a pretty dang good decade for the man himself. Fully retired for the first time in the year 2000. By the middle of the decade, though, he was out and back at it, giving her one last good run in the WWE. He gave us some memorable stuff during this decade, like his match with Edge at WrestleMania 22, ECW One Night Stand 2, also matches with Randy Orton and Flair. I mean, tons of high-profile stuff that Foley actually did in the decade of the 2000s. So, and let's not to mention his little brief TNA run right afterwards as well. Who would have thought this reality TV guy from the real world would still have a job with WWE to this day, over 20 years later? I wouldn't think so, but hey, here we are. And I'm not saying that to knock the guy, I'm just saying. People talk about this in WWE until the cows come home, where he worked for it, and even though he was just on our TVs for the second half of the decade, he worked very, very hard to set himself up for very good things in the next decade. Ron Killings, better known as R-Truth, was kind of here, there, and everywhere during the decade. He started out as K-Quick in WWE, but then around 2002, 2003, he became a very instrumental part in the formation of TNA Wrestling. He was one of their big stars and main eventers, and something I suggest people dig up. Ron Killings from TNA 2002, 2003-ish. It gives you a really interesting glimpse as to what he could have been as a serious wrestler. Not to knock the guy, I mean, he's made himself a heck of a career in WWE as being a comedy character throughout the years. Don't get me wrong, but my favorite stuff is that early TNA stuff. And well, then he would bounce back to WWE and was essentially the birth of the endearing comedy character we all know and love today. You know, of all the Team Canada guys in TNA, Bobby Roode, of course, always stood out as the blue chipper of them all, let's be honest. He would prove that time and time again throughout the decade of the 2000s. His best work with TNA, though, was probably in the next decade. Be that as it may, I think he fits okay right here. I mean, these were his last high-profile days, and while they were rare, I think they were impactful. See what I did there? Impact. TNA. He wasn't just in TNA, though, during this decade. I mean, he was in WCW there in the dying days in the 2000, 2001, brought into the WWE in 2002, and was there off and on for the next few years. Of course, he spent most of that time laid up and hurt. I think he even came back as Diesel at one point just to, do it one more time, sort of a thing. And he did quite a few matches in TNA, I think, to kind of close out the decade as well. So maybe he was a little more active than I'm remembering. You know what I mean? In the dying days of WCW, I think they held Kidman in pretty high regard there. And so when the company died and his contract got absolved by the WWE, at the end of the day, he was one of the guys that was treated more decently than a lot of them. Was given a pretty prominent, consistent spot on the lower mid-card for the next few years or so, and then he settled into an agent role after that. So he definitely played his cards right. Good for him. Perhaps always doomed to be in the shadow of Uncle Eddie, of course, but Chavo did some great stuff during this decade. WCW on into WWE. My favorite and probably most endearing of them all would be his run with his brother as the Los Guerreros. I think we all kind of want to forget about Kerwin White, if you know what I mean, but hot take here, I think if Chavo would have broken away from the WWE system earlier, perhaps after the death of Eddie Guerrero, if he would have maybe moved on to TNA at that point in time, I think he could have been made TNA World Champion. I mean, I seriously believe that. He didn't end up leaving, though, till way later. The Fallen Angel was technically on the WCW roster as it closed. WWE flirted with the idea of signing him for years, but ultimately he would spend most of this decade of the 2000s working for TNA Wrestling. I'll throw out these words once again of cornerstone and pillar, and you could definitely consider Christopher Daniels one of those. A trailblazer of the X Division, if you will. Speaking of guys carrying the torch for TNA, same stuff you can say about Jay Lethal right here. One of the cornerstones of that company during this decade, and it definitely, this counts for something with all these guys. When we talk about these TNA guys, when we talk about Ring of Honor guys, these are the only alternatives we had to WWE wrestling. So once again, I don't think their value can be discredited too much just because they did it on a smaller stage. But of course, as always, it's going to be something that we take into consideration. I believe Jerry Lynn was on the ECW roster as it closed, and he would hit the indies for a couple years before he would land in WWE, which was actually his second run there, but regardless, a lot of talented cruiserweights came through the doors of the WWE in the 2000s just to leave disappointed. This guy burst onto our TVs in the year 2005 WWE. Honestly, for the most part, I think it was mostly because he had a really cool gimmick where he would be his own ring announcer, and when he announced his name, he would echo his name. I don't know, it sounds kind of silly just saying it out loud. You had to be there, I guess. WWE gave him a few stop-start pushes, and it was enough to leave a bad enough taste in his mouth that by 2007, he was gone to TNA Wrestling, and that's where he spent the latter part of the decade as Mr. Anderson. Perhaps in TNA, he was a much bigger fish in a smaller pond. Come to think of it, he would be a neat guy to see return just out of nowhere. You know what I mean? Even if it was just for a little cameo appearance or something like that. It almost feels criminal to have him this far down on this list, but I tell you what, his best work was yet to come. Everyone knows Punk's story pretty well, I think. Killed it in Ring of Honor, then went and killed it in OVW, went up to the WWE main roster, and then he'd kill it some more. He was even in TNA for a cup of coffee there for a minute. I almost forgot. Anyway, yeah, pretty much just writes itself. Talked about Charlie Haas earlier. Pretty huge gap between their ranking spots here. Shelton, it really looked like he was earmarked to be the future of the business at one point. For whatever reason, he fell short of the WWE's expectations for that, and he ended up just kind of floundering out. Ended up in Ring of Honor by the end of the decade. His in-ring work and potential, man, what could have been. Another guy on the WCW roster the day that it closed, who ended up getting picked straight up by the WWE. They never really knew what to do with him. Cycled through different gimmicks like the Canadian thing. He probably wants to forget dancing Lance Storm, of course, but he did great work, and then I believe ended up retiring at ECW One Night Stand 2005. Correct me if I'm wrong. I may make a mistake here or there, folks, but this is the real deal, okay? This is me talking to you. Gosh, I know some people are going to totally crucify me over this, but in all honesty though, I mean, what are we looking at? The first 3 years of the decade, and a lot of 2002, he wasn't even there in WWE. He was on a leave of absence. He also missed significant time in the year 2000, if I remember right. It's Stone Cold. We all love Stone Cold, but he was on his way out. I think that he'll even admit that kind of post 2001, he wasn't mentally or physically the best version of himself. Be that as it may though, we all love Stone Cold, so you gotta give it to him. Cheers. What can you say? Consistent work from the guy pretty much throughout the whole decade of the 2000s, and I would say maybe arguably his best work and definitely his most high-profile work. So I know it sounds weird ranking him above some guys here like Stone Cold especially, who was just on the list, but I'm justifying it due to the quality and body of work and the quantity. When you really look at it, this guy had one hell of a decade in the 2000s. He leaves, goes to TNA, is pretty much the guy in TNA for a couple years there, is pretty much their main star. Then comes back to WWE, wins his first world championship there, closes out the decade there as a pretty prominent player. Underrated and unnoticed, I think. Brother, you knew he had to be on the list, brother. It don't work for me, brother, unless I'm higher on the list, dude. Hulk, there's nothing I can do. I'm sorry. It is what it is. Well, that don't work for me, brother. All right, sorry, Hulk. Next caller. Woo! Let me tell you something. All right, okay, what the heck is going on? Who doesn't love the Hardy Boys? Once again, another tag team with members that really stood alone out in singles competition as well. And Matt was at least solid mid-card status in WWE for most of the 2000s, even as a singles wrestler. I think you could definitely make the argument that this decade was probably Matt's best. He started the decades as just Bradshaw, the guy from the APA, and who would have thought the turnaround that he made right around 2005, becoming this JBL character, and essentially overnight becoming a main event world champion heel. It was the damnedest thing, let me tell you. Whatever year that this happened in, I was kind of in and out of watching WWE for whatever reason, and when I came to and was told about JBL being a world champion, it really astounded me. By the end of the 2000s, JBL was retired, but you gotta give it to him, he ended up having quite the career in the 2000s. After the very last match in WCW history where he defeated Ric Flair, we all sat and waited for the day that Sting would come to the WWE. But this would not happen during the decade of the 2000s. Instead, right around the middle of the decade, he finally landed with TNA Wrestling and basically became their flagship legend or icon, if you will. He was once again the franchise player, even if that franchise was now the AA ball club, basically. Booker T rode out into that sunset as the very last WCW champion, and he historically carried that title into the WWE in 2001. From there, within a good year or so, Booker T became one of the main event players in the WWE. Although it did come with its ups and downs. The downs being losing to Triple H at WrestleMania 19 for no apparently good reason. And of course, the ups would be his very solid run as King Booker, where he held that WWE World Heavyweight Championship proudly. By the end of the decade, though, he was at odds with the company and found himself in TNA Wrestling. His career was winding down at this time, so I think he was mainly enjoying a lighter schedule. A lot of people out there will argue that his run could have been a lot better. I would argue that it could have been a lot worse. I think Mr. Paul White did pretty dang good for himself in the 2000s in WWE. Another guy with some ups and downs, but a lot of title wins in there. There's a lot on the resume for the Big Show to be proud of, and at number 20, that's a pretty dang good showing, I would say. With a full decade of work, perhaps could have been the number one wrestler during the decade. But we only really got him for a few part-time years during the 2000s, and that was it. Outside of some appearances here and there, of course. Be that as it may, the impact he had then and now to this day, all of that was set in stone with a lot of the things he did, and especially the earlier part of the decade. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Once again, another limited time frame, but huge impact, I will say. His run in WWE, only a couple years. Monumental, though, I would say. He changed a lot of things for a lot of young wrestlers, for better or for worse. It's funny that these two ended up back-to-back on the list because essentially that is kind of how WWE viewed them as well. At one point, they had made Brock Lesnar the youngest world champion in history just to shortly be dethroned by Randy Orton with that title. Orton, of course, edges him out here because obviously so much more work during the decade. We're getting down to the nitty-gritty here, guys, and as far as what I consider true TNA talents of this decade, Samoa Joe is right up there in that top echelon of those guys. Man, we're just really rolling through them right here at this point. What else can we say about Kane? Championships, memorable moments, mask, no mask, doesn't matter. The man Glenn Jacobs made an impression on so many people. The Big Red Machine, am I right? First couple years of the decade, he was retired. We then got him back in 2002. I think there's definitely an argument to be made for the 2000s to be the better Shawn Michaels decade than the 90s. Of course, I ranked him higher on the 90s list, but be that as it may, I think there's an argument there. I mean, you just look at all of his WrestleMania matches during this decade, and geez. This is the highest that a true TNA wrestler is going to appear on this countdown, just to let you know. And I think that it's a pretty good badge of honor for him to be at this spot. We all know AJ Styles was amazing during these years, but once again, it was in TNA wrestling on a smaller platform, on a smaller scale. Man, am I relieved that that's the last time I'm going to have to say that during this countdown, let me tell you. Jericho really went through it during this decade. I know his story pretty well. Kind of a struggling mid-carder as the decade began, but just a couple years later, main eventing WrestleMania. He really solidified himself as a main event guy from there, but he did take a couple years off in the middle of the decade, only to return to WWE in late 2007. From there, you can argue that he did even better work. When it's all said and done, I think I can say definitively that the 2000s was Jericho's best decade in the business. Talk about a transformation that you never saw happening. To be honest, my first impressions of Batista was that he was just another brainless monster. And to be honest, I think he kind of was that for a while. And it's just amazing how he really grew a personality over time. It didn't take overnight. It wasn't as quick as a chia pet or anything like that, but it was almost like a nice tree, you know? It just really stabilized himself over a few years' time. And by 2005, he was world champion, and there was no looking back from there. Can't argue as far as WWE goes, one of the top guys in the promotion for that back nine of the 2000s. It took a little bit, you know, but WWE eventually brought Rey Mysterio in after the closing of WCW. And obviously, I think it went better than anyone could have ever hoped or imagined. I talked a lot on this countdown about smaller wrestlers really not being accepted and given pushes in WWE. Rey Mysterio, the exception to the rule. I think, honestly, the instant marketability to children and stuff like that with his masks and his character, I believe Vince McMahon knew what he was doing with Rey Mysterio from day one, and it shows. We all love Eddie. He would probably be number one on this countdown if he would have lived past 2005, quite honestly. And we also can't forget that there were a lot of these years here in the early part of the decade where it was touch and go, where he was having problems and this and that and the other thing. So we could have done a lot more before, and obviously would have done a lot more had he lived a lot longer. Granted, not your typical traditional good wrestler. In fact, there's going to be a subsection of the audience that's just going to call him a stuntman and say that that's all he's ever been. But undeniably, without question, he was one of the most popular superstars that the WWE had in the decade of the 2000s. And this is talking even from the early days of the Hardy Boys and then his singles runs later on. Of course, very controversial. He was in and out of the WWE during the decade as well. When he would have substance abuse issues and the WWE would let him go, TNA would be standing over here going, "Hey, we'll take you, Jeff. Go ahead. Come on in. Yeah, we can use you. Yeah." No one wants to talk about that, but it is what it is, right? He ended up ending the decade with a world title win or two, and that combined with his popularity vaulted him into the top 10, baby. What could have been with Rob Van Dam, you know? He pretty much transitioned from ECW right into WWE at the closure, was a huge part of the invasion angle, and they really could have put the rocket on him then, but because of politics, it was decided, nope, not quite yet. He hasn't been here long enough yet, so we can't do that. Even though he was insanely popular, and it's just ridiculous looking back at it. But no, Van Dam had to earn it, so he did. He spent the next 4 years years working his tail off, finally gets a spot, finally wins the WWE Championship by beating John Cena at One Night Stand 2. Everything's looking great, then all of a sudden he gets pulled over with some weed in his car. And all of a sudden he's not champion anymore. It's really more of a protest, him being on this spot more than anything, because we'll never know what could have been. For something as silly as the guy having pot in the car. It's legal in most states now, for crying out loud. These tag team guys in the 2000s did not mess around. Edge, another guy from a tag team that was also just destined for singles greatness. By 2007, he was a bona fide main event star, prolific world champion, and depending on the situation, was either a fan favorite or loved to be hated. What else can you say about Kurt Angle that hasn't already been said? The first 6 years of the decade, top tier WWE star, champion, main eventer. He abruptly leaves in 2006 to TNA Wrestling. From there, he gave his absolute blood, sweat, and tears trying to put that company on the map in that latter half of the decade. If you want to go back and see some of the greatest wrestling matches ever crafted, go to some of that late 2000s TNA Kurt Angle stuff, because it's absolutely amazing. He was totally out of his mind on drugs most of the time, but it's absolutely amazing. Hunter pretty much owned this decade as far as the WWE goes, especially the early part of it. He had his name written all over it and then some. Almost every single WrestleMania main event, championships, pretty much the focus of the company at pretty much any given time. You could point to Triple H. I gotta admit, at the time, I got kind of sick of it like a lot of people did, but I look back on it with fondness. This is pretty much self-explanatory right here. Of course, it was kind of a slow start to the decade for John, but I'll be damned if WrestleMania in 2005, it didn't all completely turn around for him, and he arguably had the best back nine of the 2000s of any wrestler alive. It was during these years that he became a bona fide main man, and for lack of a better term, the next Hulk Hogan, the generational talent that we may not have asked for, but we all got. Just kidding, he was all right. Of course, you could figure this out kind of by process of elimination, and if I hadn't said Taker at this point, I either made a really huge mistake or he was going to be number one. And here's my argument as far as this goes. There was a lot of guys out there during this decade. A lot of guys putting on great matches, a lot of guys doing great main events, a lot of guys drawing a lot of money, a lot of guys drawing a lot of interest. But on a year in, year out basis, especially from about 2004 on, you could argue that the central focus of the wrestling world once the year would start, and the question on everyone's mind, who's wrestling The Undertaker at WrestleMania? Sometimes it would be discussed to a more at-length degree than even what was going on in the WWE title picture. As a wrestler and as a presence, I don't think you can argue with the fact that he absolutely eclipsed everything else in this regard. And while 90s Taker was pretty good and 2010's Undertaker was all right, challenge me on the fact that 2000's Taker wasn't the absolute best. That's it. Read 'em and weep, wrestling fans. I just made another 100 list. Isn't that freaking crazy? We did it together, guys. We pulled through together. Pretty sure a spider was just crawling on me. Thank you very much for watching. Please, once again, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and on your way out, leave a like on this video. I hope to see you next time right here on Pro Wrestling Planet.